Good evening to all, and welcome to the 5th of 6 sessions of the 2026 Naturalist webinar series. For folks that haven't been with us before, my name is Dana Ripper. I'm with the Missouri River Bird Observatory, also known as MRBO. And also with us tonight is my MRBO co-founder and co-director, Ethan Duke. Our mission at MRBO is the conservation of birds and all wildlife and their habitats through science, education, and advocacy. I know we always have quite a lot of repeat attendees, and I'm so glad for that. I'm not going to do a lengthy introduction of the organization. You can always find out more about us on our website at mrbo.org. I also want to note that we're recording all of these webinars, and they will be up on the MRBO YouTube channel. All of them are up within a few days, thanks to Ethan. And in addition to this whole Winter Naturalist series and the plastic pollution series that some folks were just talking about in the chat, you can find around 200 past webinars on a huge range of topics. Want to remind you of and announce some upcoming events. I'm going to put some links in the chat. Everything I'm going to announce are all in-person events here in Missouri. The first links I'm going to place are for community workshops on plastic pollution and how we can take action on that issue. We have one here in Marshall, Missouri, where Ethan and I are broadcasting from tonight, this coming Wednesday, so 2 days from now. One at the Mark Twain Lake Boudreaux Visitor Center on Saturday, March 28th, which is actually preceded by a litter cleanup with Missouri Stream Teams United. That's right before the workshop. Folks in Kansas City, I am really excited to announce that on April 11th, we'll be hosting our first community plastic workshop in the KC area. And we've also just announced a workshop in Rolla on May 9th. So I'm going to put all of those in the chat, I hope. That should be in there now. And then on non-plastic topics, we have MRBO's premier nature festival, of which we're a co-host along with Experience Arrow Rock. This is the Birds, Bees, and Blooms Festival in Arrow Rock on April 25th. A new event that we just organized, we are co-hosting a Resilient Activist workshop at Runge Nature Center in Jefferson City on May 2nd. This is the Resilient Activists 5 Essentials for a Resilient World. And I'm also delighted to announce a Prairie and Grasslands Celebration and Learning Opportunity event on May 30th in and around Sedalia, Missouri. We'll have 2 tracks of field trips, so kind of basic ecology and wildlife, and then one for folks who are farmers and ranchers. We will have lunch and then a series of 3 concurrent presentations of 5 each in 3 separate rooms. So if you're on the MRBO email list or get our printed news, a big flyer will be out for that in both of those media, but I'm going to put the registration link here as well. So here are those 3 events. In the chat they are. And now on to our webinar of the evening. We are super excited to welcome Dr. Cheyenne Stratton. I have been waiting for weeks and weeks to hear about crayfish. I love them. Dr. Stratton is the aquatic invertebrate ecologist at the Missouri Department of Conservation, where she leads research and monitoring of the state's aquatic invertebrates with a strong emphasis on Missouri's diverse crayfish fauna. The aquatic invertebrate program focuses on understanding and conserving species of conservation concern, as well as monitoring and managing invasive crayfish populations across the state. Cheyenne received her PhD in Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences from the University of Florida in 2025, where her research examined how pathogens shape the impacts and outcomes of biological invasions using the rusty crayfish invasion in northern Wisconsin as a model system. She received her BS in Fisheries and Wildlife from the University of Missouri in 2018. As an undergraduate student, she worked as a technician for MDC's Aquatic Invertebrate Program, formerly known as the Statewide Crayfish Program, where she developed a passion for crayfish ecology and conservation. So, Cheyenne, the floor is all yours.
Perfect. All right, is that coming through all right?
All good.
All right, good evening. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'm very excited to talk about the diversity and importance of Missouri's crayfish with you all. My goal for this webinar is to provide an overview of crayfish diversity, explain the ecological importance of crayfish, discuss what threats they're facing, and share some of the conservation efforts we're taking related to Missouri's crayfish. Before diving straight into crayfish diversity, we need to address the question, what is the difference between a crayfish, a crawfish, and a crawdad? Essentially, there isn't a difference. We just can't agree on what to call them. There's no shortage of names for these critters, ranging from crayfish, crawfish, crawdads, to mudbugs, spoondogs, and ditch crickets. What you call them largely depends on where you're from. The Northeast and Upper Midwest tend to call them crayfish, while the Southeastern US calls them crawfish, and us Missourians tend to call them crawdads. One rule of thumb some folks go by is crawfish are what you eat, crawdads are what you fish with, and crayfish are what you study. No matter what you call them, they all refer to the same animal, a 10-legged crustacean related to lobster, shrimp, and crabs. Some even call them freshwater lobsters because that's essentially what they are. That diversity of names hints at the diversity of crayfish themselves. Worldwide, there are more than 750 species of crayfish, which are found on every continent except Antarctica and continental Africa. On this map, the darker the blue, the more crayfish species present. From that, we can see North America is the global center of diversity with more than 470 species and subspecies of crayfish, most of which occur east of the Rocky Mountains. Here's a closer look at crayfish diversity within North America, highlighting the fact the diversity hotspot in North America is found in the southeastern part of the U.S., which is indicated by the red and orange states. This includes Missouri's Ozark region. Missouri is a key stronghold for crayfish conservation in the central U.S., with over 40 native taxa, which includes species and subspecies that represent 8 genera. This map highlights crayfish diversity by our state's watershed boundaries. Watersheds that are yellow have the highest diversity of native species, while watersheds that are darker purple have lower diversity. From this, we can see every watershed has at least one species present, and our watersheds with the greatest diversity occur in southern Missouri, specifically southeastern Missouri, indicated by those in the yellow and orange. The state's geographical and ecological diversity contributes to its crayfish diversity. Missouri is divided into 4 ecoregions, the Ozark regions making up most of the southern part of the state, the Boot Heel lowlands making up the southeastern corner of the state, the Prairie region consisting of most of the northern half of the state, and our big rivers, which include the Missouri and Mississippi River. Each of these ecoregions support distinct crayfish communities with some overlap between regions. Geographically, the Ozarks has the greatest diversity with 24 taxa, followed by the lowlands with 14 species, and finally the Prairie region, which supports 6 species of crayfish. The big rivers have 6 common species that also occur within the other regions. On the previous map, we saw the watersheds that span both the Ozark and lowland regions had the highest crayfish diversity, and that's because those watersheds occur in both of these unique ecoregions, which each contain a unique assemblage of crayfish species. Further supporting Missouri's importance for crayfish conservation in the U.S. is the fact Missouri has 8 crayfish species that are endemic to our state, meaning these species do not occur anywhere else in the world outside of Missouri. Going clockwise, starting at the top left, this includes the belted crayfish, the freckled crayfish, the saddle-backed crayfish, the Caney Mountain cave crayfish, the Big Creek crayfish, St. Francis River crayfish, woodland crayfish, and the Salem cave crayfish. In addition, we have 15 species that are considered Ozark endemics, meaning a significant portion of their range occurs within our state, but also extends into neighboring Ozark states like Arkansas and Oklahoma. Crayfish in Missouri occupy a wide variety of habitats, and essentially, water equals crayfish in Missouri. Based on their preferences, they can be grouped into four broad categories: stream dwellers, swamp, marsh, and pond dwellers, cave dwellers, and primary burrowers. These categories overlap to some extent. For example, some species inhabit seasonally flooded wetlands during winter and early spring, then retreat to burrows once the surface water dries in late spring and summer. We also see habitat partitioning, meaning species occurring in these habitats will further divide up the available habitat. For example, stream-dwelling crayfish species can be divided based on whether they prefer fast-moving riffles or slower pools and backwaters. We also see a change in habitat use based on age classes, with juvenile crayfish using different habitats than adults. Most crayfish species in Missouri live in streams and rivers. They're often found under rocks, woody debris, or in shallow riffles and pools. These habitats are especially abundant in the Ozarks, where rocky stream beds are clear flowing water provide ideal habitat. Some crayfish species prefer still waters such as lakes, ponds, and wetlands where aquatic vegetation or sunken woody debris provide shelter. In lowlands and floodplains, crayfish often occupy backwaters, ditches, sloughs, and swamps. These habitats are highly variable with fluctuating water levels and frequent seasonal drying. Several Missouri species are adapted to these conditions. Missouri's karst landscapes support a unique group of cave-dwelling crayfish. These species live in underground streams, pools, and wells and are adapted to life in darkness. Cave crayfish often have reduced pigmentation and eyesight, relying instead on tactile and chemical cues to navigate and find food. These creatures have slow growth and are generally long-lived. There are 3 cave-adapted crayfish species in Missouri. Not all crayfish live in open water. Several Missouri species are primary burrowers, spending most of their lives underground. They dig burrows in moist soils near wetlands, prairies, or floodplains, often building distinctive mud chimneys at the burrow entrance. Primary burrows only come up out of their burrows to eat and mate. The burrows of these crayfish can extend to the water table up to 20 feet and can support dense crayfish populations. They can have multiple tunnels leading to a primary chamber or large room. This is depicted in the bottom left figure, where we see crayfish chimneys and entrances at the surface that lead into tunnels, eventually leading to a large chamber that's at the water table. They can plug these burrows during dry and cold periods to maintain moisture within the burrow, as pictured in the bottom right photo. To create the telltale chimneys, burrowing crayfish use their claws to burrow down and roll mud into balls, which they push out of the entrance, forming the chimney. Next, we're going to discuss what role crayfish play in the environment. Crayfish are what is known as polytrophic, which essentially means they will eat almost anything. This includes living plant material such as algae and macrophytes, living animal flesh including insects, snails, fish, and even other crayfish, as well as dead and decaying plant and animal matter, which includes leaves, woody debris, microbes, and carcasses. Crayfish will not go hungry, as they really do eat anything and everything. On the other hand, everything eats crayfish. There are over 200 documented predators of crayfish and counting, and this includes aquatic, terrestrial, and avian predators. Some species are highly dependent on crayfish, with crayfish supporting a significant part of their diets. This includes popular sport fish like smallmouth bass and rock bass, and other species like hellbenders and otters rely on crayfish for up to 90% of their diet, emphasizing the fact that everything does eat crayfish. The fact that crayfish eat everything and everything eats crayfish makes them a vital part of both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. This, along with a few other reasons, makes them a keystone species, meaning their presence in an ecosystem drives and alters the ecosystem as a whole. There are few animals capable on feeding on so many different sources, and the energy they gain from these various sources is passed up the food chain to the many predators that eat them. This diagram helps highlight how connected crayfish are within an aquatic system, with the blue arrows indicating the diversity of resources crayfish eat, and the red arrows indicating the diversity of animals that eat crayfish, which again spans to aquatic, terrestrial, and avian predators. Another reason they're considered to be a keystone species is due to their role in nutrient cycling within aquatic systems. Crayfish are the largest decomposers of dead plant material in Missouri streams. They grind up leaves and woody material into very small particles that become food for other invertebrates, which leads to nutrients being recycled through the food web. And due to their ability to alter food and nutrient availability in systems and their consumption of these resources, crayfish are capable of completely restructuring plant and invertebrate communities within an ecosystem. In addition, crayfish are considered to be ecosystem engineers, meaning they create or modify habitats that impact other organisms. Their feeding behavior of eating algae and dead material helps to clean stream bottoms, and all crayfish, even the stream dwellers, are capable of creating at least rudimentary burrows, as depicted at the bottom of this figure here, which creates shelter for other organisms. The importance of crayfish as ecosystem engineers is even more significant for our primary burrowing crayfish. These crayfish create important habitat for many other species, and these burrows can be the primary shelters for many organisms, particularly in the prairie region of our state, where rocks aren't commonly available for shelter. The burrows can provide shelter year-round and provide escape from summer heat and refuge from fire. Without crayfish burrows, some herps, like snakes and amphibians, would not occur in certain areas. In Missouri, the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, the northern crawfish frog, and the Graham's crayfish snake would not occur in the state without crayfish burrows. Crayfish burrows are also incredibly important for the state and federally endangered Hines emerald dragonfly. The first several years of a dragonfly's life is actually spent in an aquatic larval form called a nymph, which is pictured in the bottom left inset. The dragonfly nymph uses crayfish burrows as its primary habitat over winter and during drier times of the year until it morphs into its terrestrial form, where it lives for only a few weeks. Crayfish burrows have other benefits for our terrestrial landscapes. Some areas are estimated to have 7 to 12 miles of crayfish tunnels per acre. This significant tunneling helps to aerate and moisten soil, which improves overall soil health and enhances native plant growth. And this picture is showing every one of these X marks is an individual crayfish chimney on this wetland landscape. So next we're going to dive into the conservation status of crayfish and what threats they're facing. Within the US, crayfish are considered to be the fourth most imperiled group of animals, just behind mussels and snails, with 55% of crayfish species in the US considered to be at risk of extinction. This graph is showing the breakdown of the level of imperilment from critically imperiled to vulnerable to extinction based on the color. And so here on the y-axis, we have our different taxa groups with crayfish highlighted here and the percent of animals at risk across the top. Many of our Missouri crayfish species face imperilment. The Missouri Department of Conservation has identified 26 of our 41 crayfish species as species of conservation concern, or SOCCs. Of these, 5 are listed as state endangered and 2 are listed as federally threatened in the Endangered Species Act, which are pictured to the left. These are our 5 state endangered species, which include the Caney Mountain cave crayfish, the coldwater crayfish, the Spring River crayfish, Big Creek crayfish, and St. Francis River crayfish. All 5 of these species have very small natural ranges, and all but the cave crayfish are actively being displaced by an invasive crayfish. The coldwater crayfish and spring river crayfish both have very limited ranges in Missouri and Arkansas and are being replaced by the invasive gap-ringed crayfish. We don't believe there are any remaining populations of the spring river crayfish in Missouri due to this invasion. The bottom two species are both endemic to the upper St. Francis River and are both being displaced by the woodland crayfish, which has caused them to become federally listed. The only natural reason for species imperilment or cause for concern is naturally small ranges. Some of the major threats crayfish face include invasive species, disease, habitat loss, and pollution. So as I stated, the only natural reason for imperilment is a naturally limited range, and more than 45% of U.S. crayfish species ranges are small enough to be contained within a single state. 56% of Missouri species only occur in Missouri and/or a neighboring Ozark state. If a species doesn't have a large range to start with, small changes in the range can have very large consequences. These are a few examples within Missouri. The Big Creek crayfish is only found in a single watershed in southeast Missouri. The 11-Point River crayfish is only found in the 11-Point River spanning Missouri and Arkansas, and the Caney Mountain cave crayfish is only found in a single cave in the world. Invasive crayfish are one of the largest threats to native crayfish populations globally, and I want to start by differentiating an introduced species versus an invasive species. An introduced species is a species that has been transported and introduced outside its natural range, and it has the potential to become invasive. Where an invasive species is an introduced species that has become established and is causing impacts to the system it has been introduced to. As of 2021, nearly all U.S. states were dealing with at least one invasive crayfish, as indicated by this map, where blue states and provinces that did not report any invasive species are highlighted in blue. In addition, more than half of the states had at least 3 invasive crayfish species present. Globally, invasive crayfish are estimated to cost at least $120.5 million annually through control, management, and damage. And in Wisconsin alone, they're estimated to cost $3 million annually in damage and loss of angler spending. So what is the deal with invasive crayfish? Why are they a problem? When they invade a system, they tend to cause declines or extirpations of native crayfish species through direct aggressive interactions, competition for resources like food and habitat, and spreading new diseases. Unfortunately, it's estimated that 4% of North American crayfish species will go extinct per decade due to invasive crayfish. In addition, invasive crayfish can cause declines in other native species like native amphibians, reptiles, mollusks, and fish, as they disrupt the ecosystem as a whole, because if we remember, crayfish are keystone species. They will directly consume amphibian and fish eggs. They often alter available habitat, usually by destroying aquatic plant beds, which serve as a food resource and habitat for many native aquatic species, and this can disrupt the food web as a whole. Crayfish are introduced to new areas one of 4 ways. First, they're a popular experimental animal and are shipped around the world through companies like Carolina Biological Supply for research purposes. They can then escape or be released from experimental facilities. The most common way crayfish are introduced globally is due to their popularity for human consumption. Live crayfish are raised and shipped all over the world for food such as crawfish boils. Crayfish are sneaky and quite the escape artists, so there are many cases of crayfish escaping prior to being cooked, leading to introduced populations. Another avenue that is becoming more problematic is keeping crayfish as pets, either at home or in the classroom. Classroom pets tend to get released into local waterways at the end of the school year, and when kids grow tired of their pet crayfish at home, they are released into the local waterway, regardless of where they were collected from. The online sale of crayfish as pets has boomed in recent years, leading to crayfish being shipped all over the world. Finally, the primary way crayfish introductions have occurred in Missouri is through bait bucket release, meaning at the end of the day, fishermen dump any leftover bait they have into whatever water body they're fishing, regardless of where the bait was collected or bought. Within Missouri, we have over 40 documented introductions, resulting from the introduction of 9 different crayfish species. This map shows the subwatersheds the species have been recorded in pink. We do have a few subwatersheds in the state that have more than one introduced species indicated by the yellow. Missouri is unique as all 9 species that have been introduced into our state also have native populations in our state. This can be a weird topic to wrap your head around, and I'm sure you're asking yourself, how can a native species also be an invasive species? Hopefully this map helps explain it. Through historical surveys, we know that this crayfish species is native to the watersheds highlighted in orange, but through continuous monitoring of our state's aquatic systems, we found the species introduced and spreading throughout a neighboring watershed indicated by the gray dots. This particular invasive is believed to be a result of bait bucket release. Many of these introductions have led to established invasive populations, which have been found to cause declines in 6 of our native crayfish species. Most of the introductions throughout Missouri are believed to be a result of live release by anglers, pet owners, and schools. Missouri has a few regulations to help limit invasive crayfish. First, there is only a single species of crayfish, the virile or northern crayfish, that is legally allowed to be sold as live bait. This went into effect in 2014. This species was chosen as it occurs throughout a majority of the state naturally. If folks wish to collect their own live bait, they must have a valid fishing permit and are limited to collecting 150 individuals per day, and crayfish species of conservation concern are not to be collected for bait. And finally, it is highly discouraged to transport and release crayfish into another body of water. The threat of disease on crayfish populations is becoming more recognized as we develop a better understanding and are realizing diseases can have significant impacts on native crayfish populations, as well as determine the success of invasive crayfish species. The crayfish plague, which is pictured here, is the most well-studied disease of crayfish as it was introduced to Europe with an invasive crayfish species and has led to multiple species of European crayfish being on the brink of extinction. The crayfish plague causes these lesions to occur throughout the body and does ultimately lead to death. Another major threat to crayfish is habitat loss. This can occur through urban development, gravel mining, channelization, and damming of our streams and rivers. These habitat modifications also lead to sedimentation in our streams or the deposition of fine sediments. The sediment clogs the spaces or crevices that typically occur between rocks on the stream bottom, and these crevices are habitat that crayfish heavily rely on. Another threat to crayfish is pollution of our waterways. This can occur through chemical and nutrient runoff or stormwater flow from urban areas. In Missouri, we deal with significant pollution due to historical lead mining within our state. The pollution from lead mining has been shown to negatively impact crayfish in our streams. Next, I want to highlight our crayfish conservation efforts in Missouri. The Aquatic Invertebrate Program at MDC was previously known as the Statewide Crayfish Program and has been running for nearly 40 years. In this time, the Crayfish Program conducted more than 30 studies focused on determining distribution, life cycles, habitat requirements, and genetics of 10 imperiled crayfish species. The program is now expanding to include other imperiled aquatic invertebrates like dragonflies, mayflies, and isopods, but we still have a significant focus on crayfish. And the aquatic invertebrate program does not include mussels or snails, as those fall to the state's malacologist. The goals of the aquatic invertebrate program are fourfold: to increase knowledge of aquatic invertebrate ecology and management, increase knowledge required to conserve imperiled species, provide public education and information, and to develop conservation strategies for aquatic invertebrates. So now I'm going to share some of what the aquatic invertebrate program has been up to. A major focus has been on the St. Francis River crayfish and Big Creek crayfish, which are endemic to the upper St. Francis River watershed, which is indicated by this map. These two crayfish have been listed as federally threatened, and these species face several threats, including the fact they are endemic to a single watershed, so they're a narrow range endemic. In addition, they are being replaced by the invasive woodland crayfish, which competes with the endemics for resources, including food and habitat, and it also hybridizes with them. And finally, this watershed has a long history of mining as well as ongoing mining, which has impacted both species. The woodland crayfish, so our invader in the St. Francis River, is native to 3 adjacent watersheds indicated by the light gray watersheds, and it was introduced to the upper St. Francis watershed, likely due to a bait bucket introduction. It was first found in Stouts Creek in 1984, which is indicated by the black triangle. MDC and partners have mapped the progression of the woodland crayfish invasion within the upper St. Francis watershed from 1998 to 2023. Each of these maps is looking at the rivers and streams of the watershed, with the black segments indicating the streams that the woodland crayfish has been found. In 1998, they were only in a couple of stream segments, and now in 2023, they're found in nearly the entire western half of the watershed. Recently, they've also been found in the main stem river and will likely begin to spread into the eastern half of the watershed with time. So after our recent efforts to document exactly where the invader is, our next step is to begin identifying refuge areas or uninvaded areas with healthy populations of St. Francis River crayfish and Big Creek crayfish to protect long term. We're also working to try to determine how to slow or stop the spread of woodland crayfish, with a potential option being to maintain or install barriers that crayfish cannot navigate, such as dams or road crossings. We're also going to continue monitoring the spread of the invader. Another project that has kept us quite busy is monitoring and managing several populations of invasive red swamp crayfish. This species is native to Missouri's boot heel, as indicated by the orange, but has been introduced to several areas around the state, including the 3 populations noted by the gray circles. Red swamp crayfish can have extremely detrimental impacts when introduced into a system, so we quickly took action when we were made aware of these 3 populations last year. One of these populations was found on the University of Missouri's campus in Columbia, and it was found in a small ornamental koi pond on campus. We immediately began an effort to attempt to eradicate or completely remove this population from the pond through crayfish trapping and removal. This graph shows our catch rate on the y-axis over an 8-week time period. And over this 8-week time frame, we removed nearly 6,000 crayfish from this tiny pond. All these crayfish were donated to Mizzou's raptor rehab, so the birds were eating very good for a few weeks. We followed up with a chemical treatment to try to kill any remaining crayfish, but haven't been completely successful yet. The red swamp crayfish are still there, but in low numbers, so we're evaluating next steps. At the same time, we were made aware of 2 populations of red swamp crayfish near St. Louis. These 2 populations are 11.5 miles apart, meaning they likely aren't the only populations of red swamp crayfish in the area, due to the fact there are several water bodies nearby and in between these 2 populations. So we are planning to do some additional sampling around the St. Louis area to see if there are additional populations. And we're also planning on launching a citizen science project in the near future to help us identify locations of invasive crayfish throughout the state, as well as document locations of our native crayfish species. This effort will piggyback off of efforts that Illinois and Indiana have recently launched through iNaturalist. So please keep an eye out in the coming months if you're interested in being a Missouri crayfish finder. We're planning to launch the project with a training on how to properly photograph crayfish, as there are certain features we need to see for crayfish identification. So moving away from the invasive species work, another project we're working on is assessing the impact of wetland restoration and management on burrowing crayfish populations. This involves sampling primary burrowing crayfish on actively managed conservation areas and on areas with restored wetlands to understand how various management practices may influence burrowing crayfish populations. So the left photo is an example of a restored wetland. This was previously an agricultural field that over time has been restored into a wetland. And then on the right, we have a actively managed conservation area wetland. So this has the water levels here are being actively controlled. So we're not only interested in the crayfish with this project, but we're also looking at the associated communities. And we want to know how communities associated with crayfish burrows are impacted. And we also are trying to get a better idea of what organisms are actually using crayfish burrows. In some instances, we have collected information through physically collecting animals from burrows, like the smallmouth salamander pictured on the left. But we are also answering this question using environmental DNA or eDNA. This method allows us to take a soil or water sample and extract animal DNA to identify what animals have been in the burrow without having to physically sample the burrow or see the organism. Our fieldwork for this project will wrap up next month, and I'm very eager to see what we find. I'm going to end with one of my personal favorites, our work with the Caney Mountain cave crayfish. This species is state endangered as it's endemic to mud cave in southern Missouri. This means this crayfish is not found anywhere else in the world outside of mud cave. This species is a cave obligate, meaning it has adapted to life in the dark, so it lacks pigmentation, has reduced eyes, and heavily relies on chemical and tactile cues to navigate its environment. Since the species only occurs in a single cave, protecting this cave and its water quality is critical to the survival of this species. Therefore, we recently began a long-term monitoring project to assess the cave's water quality to understand what the water quality should look like. This includes measuring things like temperature, dissolved oxygen, ammonium, and nitrate. The goal is to understand how the water quality changes throughout the year and to have a baseline data set to compare any water quality changes to. We get to visit the cave every 6 months for this project and observed a very healthy population of crayfish on every visit, like this crayfish carrying eggs. All right, so a brief overview of what we've learned. First, we learned about how diverse crayfish are and that the US is a hotspot for crayfish diversity. We learned Missouri has over 40 taxa of crayfish, and essentially anywhere in Missouri with water can have crayfish, which can be divided into 4 groups based on their habitat preferences, which include stream dwellers, swamp and pond dwellers, cave dwellers, and primary burrowers. Next, we learned about the ecological importance of crayfish, including that crayfish eat everything and everything eats crayfish. This partially explains why crayfish are considered a keystone species, and then that they are also considered to be an ecosystem engineer. We then learned about their conservation status and the fact 55% of crayfish in the U.S. face imperilment, with 26 of our 41 species in Missouri listed as species of conservation concern. This is in part due to the fact many of our species have limited natural ranges, but also due to the many threats they face, including invasive species, disease, habitat loss, and pollution. Finally, we learned about Missouri's conservation efforts related to crayfish through the Aquatic Invertebrate Program at the Missouri Department of Conservation and a few of the projects we're currently working on. Thank you all so much for tuning in and letting me share some of my passion for crayfish with you all. I'm happy to take any questions and also have provided my email if you have any follow-up questions.
Was that your dog?
Yeah.
Thank you. We have quite a lot of questions. Eth, do you want to take over, or Cheyenne, you feel free to look in the Q&A yourself as well?
Yeah, looks like we have 7 in the Q&A there. I'll take another look here at the chat just to make sure we're not missing anything. Nope, nothing in the chat. So that's a nice comments. But
All right, should I just go through the Q&A questions?
sure.
If you can see them well, please.
Okay, I think I got them pulled up. So the first question, are the invasive species invasive to the US entirely, or are some of them native to some states but invasive in others? Correct. Most of our invaders throughout the US do have a native population somewhere in the US and have just been moved around and introduced into other states. How do they survive the winter? Crayfish will kind of enter a hibernation-like state where they will burrow down. So even our stream-dwelling crayfish do burrow under rocks and get down to a more secure location and become fairly inactive over winter months to be able to survive the winter. How will we find info on crayfish finders? So once that program does launch, the Missouri Department of Conservation will have some media releases surrounding that to provide more information and provide access to where the project is listed, but it will be integrated with iNaturalist. Does MDC breed captive endangered species to reintroduce? We do not at this time. It is something that we have been talking a lot about, but we haven't started at this point. There are some other folks in West Virginia that have just kind of gone through the first successful round of captive breeding for reintroduction of endangered crayfish. So they're really leading the way in that regard. We have burrowing crayfish at St. Vincent Park. Should we try to learn more about them? Absolutely. I think everyone should learn more about crayfish, and if you take photos, so we'll eventually have a training on how to properly take photos of crayfish, but really you need a good photo of the top of the crayfish and the underside of the crayfish, and we can usually ID them that way, especially the burrowing crayfish. And you can send photos to my email and I'm happy to try to tell you what they are. I have a small pond that's been undisturbed for years. Am I likely to have crayfish? How do you catch them? You probably do have crayfish, depending on what part of the state you're in. You can either try to catch them with by hand or with a net. There are also crayfish traps that you can bait with things like beef liver and dog food. On private land, you're okay to do that without a fishing permit, but usually you do have to have a fishing permit to be able to sample for crayfish. Are there any crayfish in northeastern Missouri and which ones? So there are a few. In northeastern Missouri, there's the stream-dwelling crayfish are going to be the virile or northern crayfish, which is one of our most common Missouri crayfish species, as well as one called the calico crayfish. Those are, if you're in a water body, those are the two you're going to come across most frequently, but you're also going to have two species of burrowing crayfish, the Great Plains mudbug and the grassland crayfish, or also known as the prairie crayfish. So there are some fun species up there. Do you work with monitoring the Heinz emerald dragonfly and its association with crawfish burrows? Yes, I am just starting to get into monitoring the Heinz emerald dragonfly and understanding more about this association with crayfish. There's a large group of us working together to try to get at the exact association and what characteristics of a crayfish burrow are ideal habitat for Heinz emerald dragonfly. So we're hoping to have more information about that in the coming years. Do the blue clawed variety come from their age or the specific species? So interestingly enough, any species of crayfish can actually have a blue variant. It's fairly rare to see the blue variation of crayfish, and this is when the whole crayfish turns blue. But any species that can happen with. You also might be referring specifically to the virile crayfish, which have very blue claws only, and that does occur with age. The claws get more blue the older and larger they get. Oh, I skipped a question, but are you wearing a crayfish art-themed sweater? Yes, I do have it's really a lobster, but a crayfish sweater. Okay, going back up to the questions. Can you elaborate more on how crayfish impact prairie ecology? Yes, so this is a topic that is being explored increasingly in recent years, as burrowing crayfish can be extremely difficult to sample due to the nature of how far their burrows can extend down, being over 20 feet deep. And so we just historically haven't been able to sample these populations very well, and they kind of were overlooked for a while. And so we didn't fully understand the impact they had in systems like prairies or wetlands. But many researchers in the last, I'd say, decade have really put a large emphasis on trying to understand more about burrowing crayfish. And we really are learning how important they are because of how extensive the tunneling is in a healthy prairie system, with an average of 7 to 12 acre or 7 to 12 miles of crayfish burrows an acre in a really healthy system. They have really positive impacts on these systems because it increases the way water is able to move through the prairie. It keeps the soil more aerated and moist, and this impacts what what plant species are able to grow in the prairie, and can be very beneficial to that regard. And we're still trying to flush out some of the other details about how else they're beneficial, but right now those are some of the main ways that we've found that they're positively impacting prairies. Is hybridization of the same genus crayfish from adjacent watersheds been documented? Yes, so if that's referring to the woodland crayfish invasion hybridizing with the St. Francis River crayfish and Big Creek crayfish, all three of those species are in the same genus, and we have documented evidence through genetics that hybridization is occurring. I can add my email address to the chat. Okay, my email should be in the chat now. What is the difference between polytrophic and omnivorous? That is a great question that I don't know that I can fully answer. I think at the base, they're pretty much the same. Omnivorous means they will eat animal and plant material. I think one of the differences might be the fact that polytrophic organisms, they're also eating dead and decaying material, and so they're a decomposer in addition to just being, I believe that is the difference, because omnivorous means an herbivore and a carnivore, and then polytrophic adds in the fact that they're also a decomposer. Do crayfish travel on land between bodies of water? Yes, they can travel on land. So this is most common to occur in the spring when it's more wet, because as long as crayfish gills stay moist, they are able to traverse land or be out of the water. And the gills are located just underneath their external shell, um, which is what they breathe through. And so as long as there's moisture on those gills, they are able to be out of the water. And you'll often see burrowing crayfish most frequently traveling on land in the springtime, as that's when they're out mating and foraging. Is there a size difference between sexes? There is. Male crayfish are typically larger than female crayfish of the same age, and male crayfish will also have much larger claws than female crayfish, as they're more aggressive, and that's part of their mating behavior. Is buying crawfish for bait controlled to help keep invasive species out of the state? Yes, that is exactly the case. Bait bucket introductions is one of the main ways species have gotten moved around the state of Missouri. And so we have put a regulation in place to help prevent that by only allowing for the virile or the northern crayfish to be sold as bait, because that species is found throughout most of the state. Are all crayfish edible? Yes. Technically, they are all edible. It's just whether they're worth the work, because most of them are a lot smaller than the ones you typically would eat for food. And so and a lot of people think crawfish are already a lot of work for the little amount of meat you get. So if you're going even smaller, it might not be worth it. How did crayfish become your passion? That's a good question. So it's essentially started my freshman year of college. I knew nothing about crayfish. I called them crawdads. I didn't, they were fishing bait and they were food. That's all I knew. but I just got an opportunity to work at the Missouri Department of Conservation on what was formerly the Crayfish Crew and is now the Aquatic Invertebrate Program. And as soon as I started learning how cool they are, I quickly started gaining a large passion for them. And the first time I saw the Caney Mountain Cave crayfish, I knew that crayfish was going to be my career from then on out, because being one of 30 people in the world to have seen a species is a really unique opportunity, and it's amazing that there's still things to be discovered outside your back door. What can private landowners do to encourage and support native populations? Ooh, that's a good question. Part of it depends on if you're talking about native populations of burrowing crayfish or stream-dwelling crayfish. If you do have a stream on your property, just ensuring that there's not erosion or sedimentation happening in that stream that would be degrading the habitat. Things like not allowing cattle or other large animals into streams can really be beneficial. And maintaining a healthy riparian corridor, so trees along your stream bank to prevent sedimentation and erosion. For burrowing crayfish, we're seeing that they prefer kind of open areas, so like mowed fields and stuff, they actually prefer over super overgrown areas with trees and lots of shrubs. And so you might find them just in your backyard. You'll come across the chimneys, and we're still kind of trying to understand what exact management practices are most beneficial for burrowing crayfish. Is there an old fossil record for crayfish? There is. There are some crayfish species that we only have fossil records for that are now extinct. So yeah, there are some fossil records. Crayfish can definitely pinch you. The pinch can be not too bad to it can draw blood depending on the crayfish. So it's best to keep your fingers to yourself. Who owns the cave where the cave crayfish lives? The Caney Mountain Cave crayfish actually occurs on a Missouri Department of Conservation area, which is great for us being able to maintain and protect that population. And so caves are fed by a defined surface area that drains into the cave system, and the department actually owns the entire area that feeds into the cave. So we have complete control over what happens to that cave, thankfully. Is it most likely to see burrowing crayfish after dark, maybe with a flashlight? Yes, actually all crayfish you're most likely to see after dark. They are nocturnal animals, and so even in a stream or a pond, if you go out with a flashlight at night, you'd be more likely to see a crayfish swimming around. And then burrowing crayfish are much more likely to be out at night. So spring nights with a flashlight in a prairie or a wetland, you have a pretty good chance of seeing burrowing crayfish. I see it's 7:30. I'm fine continuing to answer questions, but I don't know if we have a cutoff limit.
Nope, we're okay.
Okay. Any suggestions for how to personally experience more of our state's crayfish diversity? That is a good question. So spending time in Ozark streams is your best bet, because that is where most of our crayfish diversity does come from. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of streams that have a super high diversity of crayfish, because they all kind of inhabit the same habitat. So each river system kind of has its unique crayfish. And so there's usually only 4 to 5 species of crayfish in any given river. So you really have to kind of move around a lot and visit different rivers, or if you're looking for burrowing crayfish, different wetlands and prairies to see a good diversity. I don't think you mentioned agriculture as a pollutant. Are the fertilizers from row crops and waste from cattle grazing impacting their habitats? Yes, if I did not mention agriculture, that was my bad. That is a big pollutant. Fertilizers, increasing nutrients in these systems does have a negative impact, as well as cattle having access to streams will pollute the streams and increase sedimentation in these areas and have negative implications. Do you ever use trail cameras to look for them? I have not. That sounds like a fun idea. It might be something to check out. I don't know how well a trail camera could work on crayfish, but it could be a fun experiment. I think that was all of the questions.
Cheyenne, I've got one more question in the chat here.
Okay.
And it is in regards to the invasive species, but are you working with other state conservation departments directly to help control invasive species?
Yeah, so it's a very collaborative approach. We have a lot of different partners with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Geological Survey, some work with the Department of Natural Resources, and then our biggest partner in that regard is the University of Missouri is a major partner helping us with that.
Well, it looks like people really enjoyed it, and we've learned a lot. I'm so glad. What a great addition to the Naturalist series that we had here. Um, Yay.
I'm happy to share. I love talking crayfish.
Well, great. We look forward to learning how to do the proper crayfish photography for ID. That's exciting stuff. I want to know that so badly.
Yeah, absolutely. We're excited to get to launch that program and are excited to share more about that.
So when can we look forward to them start creeping out of their burrows here?
Um, Actually, the last week with the warmer weather, we've already gotten several reports of them starting to wander around a little bit. So I don't know exactly how today and tomorrow are going to impact that and how long it's going to be before they're out and about again, but they were becoming active last week.
Wow. Thanks, spring, everybody. Awesome.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I really appreciate you all having me.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
everybody.
much. Everybody have a good night and look for crayfish when it gets warm again.